This is an overview of the original Casambi app update and firmware revision that will be introduced at the end of September 2024. There's a few new features and functions coming with the next firmware and app update. First of all, and primarily, there will be a new function for switches, which is called controls priority, and for that you'll be able to define a scene and its level that it triggers at in the Casambi control hierarchy. Second option will be the support for single button or closed contact support, which hasn't been possible in Casambi before. It's always been momentary contact switches rather than a totally closed contact, from example a volt-free contact of a relay. There's also support for a new Enotion keycard switch, typically used for hotel room applications, for example. We'll also be supporting on-off toggle switch functionality, so as in a normal switch where it latches closed in one position and latches open in a different position. There's also a new faceplate option for battery switches and Enotion switches. There will be new firmware specifically for DALI gateway products to enable more functionality to be accessed via DALI gateway, and there's some other small UI updates. The new firmware revision will be 44. For people who've been doing the beta testing, it's the same version as 43.8 beta version, and the app version will be revised to 3.15.0. So first of all, the new switch functionality, controls priority. It's found in the same settings as other settings for the switches, in the same properties as controller scene or control all luminaires. The controls priority option, if chosen, then allows you to trigger two different scenes depending on whether the switch is then opened or closed, or being opened or being closed. So there's an active state for when the switch is closed and an inactive state for when the switch is then opened, and those states are actually scenes. You can select one scene per state, so you can have an active scene and an inactive scene triggered, and then for either one of those options you can select activation priority level, and this means that you can trigger a scene at a different level in the Casambi control hierarchy than manual control. Manual control is default for switches because it's a manual action, but with the control priority option you can select the scene to trigger at a priority level higher than manual, or at the lowest priority automation. Those are actually then two new priority levels that then are introduced in the Casambi system. Emergency, as you can see on the right there, has been previously an option only available through the smart switching function, and emergency priority means that any scene triggered at that priority level overrides absolutely everything else in the system. So if you've got a luminaire being controlled by an emergency priority scene, you cannot control it in any other way at all, whether it's manually, whether it's from timers switches, whether it's externally from a DALI system. It won't do anything but stay on the emergency scene until that emergency scene is disabled. And lowest priority automation, of course, then allows the scene to trigger at very lowest priority, but you can still get timers, etc., overriding that scene that's been triggered. Higher than manual also enables you to trigger a scene at a higher level than manual control, but lower than emergency, which means that that scene won't be overridden by any of the lower priority commands in the system. This has particular use when it comes to the Enotion keycard functionality, for example, which we'll describe a bit later on. The new priority control priority options resulting in new hierarchy features means that there's now more levels of control hierarchy available in the Kasambi system. Typically, previously, most normal networks would have date timer, presence, day timer overriding presence, date timer overriding presence, and manual control as the main options. There has previously been, and still is of course available in the system, a higher than manual priority, which was available as only through the DALI gateway, DCS DALI gateway you could assign the higher than manual functionality, and via smart switching you could enable the emergency functionality. So those were there previously, so they're not new, but they haven't typically been shown on the hierarchy description. But now this is the full hierarchy description from lowest priority to highest priority types of commands. The icons there are just for representation. They're not necessarily the standard icons that will be used in the Kasambi system. But for example, if you have a scene that's triggering on a luminaire at higher than manual priority, it will have an indication, a little icon in the top right corner of the luminaire, in the same way as if it's being controlled by presence sensor or a timer. Timer will show a little clock, presence sensor will show a little sensor icon. There's a little icon in the top right of the luminaire icon to indicate that it's being controlled at higher than manual priority. So this is good to know that there's then new priority levels. This of course increases possible functions that you can achieve within the system, increases the flexibility of the system, but it also increases the complexity of programming and means that you've got to be more aware if you're using manual control with the control priority feature to activate a scene at a different priority level than manual control, because you then have to be aware that you might at some point in time have a switch that's triggering at higher than manual, and then you wonder why other switches can't control the luminaires because they're only controlling at manual control priority. So it takes a bit of careful planning to use the option. With single button support, which is a new feature, it's suitable for any switch that has basically a one button input. So it's just a contact closure. And when it's short circuited, it triggers one action, and the action of opening the switch triggers another option. For the N-Ocean faceplates, there's a specific faceplate you can choose that's shown in the diagram, but the same feature is available for Kasambi enabled single input switches or N-Ocean switch or custom battery switches. The N-Ocean keycard switch support supports a new module that's being released by N-Ocean. The PTM535BZ module is used in a keycard module, and you can imagine a typical hotel room where you need to go, you have a key card to enter the door, and then you go in and you put the key card into a slot to activate your lighting. This is exactly the intention of this product, and you compare this product to Kasambi network in the same way as you pair a normal N-Ocean switch using near field communication, and then you can select the faceplate. There's a new faceplate option available, and then the on model version, and two faceplates available, because there's two versions of this switch available. One that basically just has one contact, and another that has 4 contacts. That's only in beta at the moment, and it's more of a very rare custom use product, so we won't go into any details about that. But basically, if we think of the standard module that's just does an action when you insert the card, it triggers a scene at one priority level, and removing the card will trigger a scene at another priority level. So for example, you walk into the hotel room, you put your key card in to the slot, it then triggers, let's say, a welcome scene for the guests who are coming into the room at normal manual control priority level, so just like a normal switch. And then people can walk through the room and use other Casambi enabled switches which are just triggering normal scenes at manual control as normal, and that would, because they're all commands at the same priority level, it would just be one action after another, so you can turn on and off things as you would in a normal hotel room. And when you then leave the room, you remove the key card from the key switch. It triggers another scene, let's say an off scene to switch all the lights off, but it triggers it at a higher than manual priority level. And that means that the off scene will be triggered, and pushing any other Casambi enabled switch in the bedroom won't have any effect because it's only triggering at manual control level, which would be a lower priority. So this is a way to keep the lights off when there's no card in the slot, and just enable normal use when the card is inserted. So that's the main intention for this product. There's also support for on-off toggle switches for Enocean and battery switches as well, so Casambi enabled battery switches from our partners. So a physically closed contact will trigger one action, and the contact being physically in another position triggers another action. So it's like a normal on-off wall switch that you can then integrate with Casambi and trigger actions there. There's also new support for normal Enocean panels, the PTM 215, 216 panels, where rather than having 1, 2 or 4 buttons, there's also a 3 button option now, where you can have 2 fixed buttons to recall scenes, for example, or just to control groups, and then you can have a 3rd button that maybe controls a scene, but you can also dim it up and down with the plus minus option. And there's 2 different panel options available for that. It's still the standard Enocean module that can be used with that. Moving on to the DALI gateway, that is going to be available with some dedicated, specific, unique firmware only for DALI gateways. The intention there is that it frees up memory space so that we can actually add new features to the DALI gateway functionality. Existing DALI gateway products that have maybe got various profiles, like the DCS, for example, that can either be just certain profile or can have a DALI gateway profile. You can, with the DCS, you can change to a DALI gateway profile, which will then also upgrade the firmware to this new firmware, but you can also change it back to another profile, and it will at the same time reload the standard Evolution firmware version for that profile. So now this then means in the Casambi world there's 3 production versions of firmware. There's the typical normal Evolution firmware, there's the firmware that the new Salvador product range uses, and there's another version of firmware just for the DALI gateway profile devices. In normal operation, you don't need to worry about anything there. Everything can be used together in the same network, the same as it always could be. Everything functions together. Normal mesh communication and normal mesh configuration and use all works as normal. The only difference with the Salvador firmware and the DALI gateway firmware is that it won't transfer Evolution firmware through the mesh. So for that reason, you have to then be very careful where you then position physically the Salvador and DCS when you're planning a network. So the DALI gateway or Salvador should be in a position where it's basically at, let's say, one end of the mesh. It doesn't physically have to be at one end of a mesh, but what should be ensured is every Evolution device in the network should be able to be within communication range of at least one other Evolution firmware device. to enable, when there's a firmware update, enable the firmware to spread through the entire mesh. So the entire evolution firmware must be able to spread through the entire mesh. Otherwise, you'll get different areas of the network that have got different firmware versions, which maybe then means that some areas of the network have a bug fix implemented and other ones don't have a bug fix implemented, or some areas of the network have new operational functionality capabilities and certain areas don't have that update. So the diagram on the right just gives an example of the different sorts of placement. So if you've got where the red X's are, you can see that if you updated the normal evolution device in the bottom left of the bottom image, it wouldn't transfer the evolution firmware update through the DCS DALI gateway to the rest of the network. Whereas in the top option, where all the evolution style firmware devices can basically hear another device, then it will transfer okay. As with Salvador, DALI gateway firmware then is only updated one device at a time individually. So even if you've got multiple Salvadors near one another, they won't transfer Salvador firmware updates to each other, and DALI gateways won't, in the same area, won't transfer DALI gateway firmware updates to each other. But because these types of devices are more or less used in volume in a network, there's usually only a few or even one of those devices. It's only a matter of doing very small 1 or 2 product updates. The introduction of the DALI gateway dedicated firmware has then enabled us to enable more features for DALI gateway. So we've now got beta features which you can see actually in the app. They're just under final testing before final official release there, but anybody can access them and use them. You've got some options in the DALI gateway parameter settings to export DALI device details, which is basically D4I data from Kasumbi enabled DALI drivers or D4I drivers that are used in the Kasumbi network. And you've got the DALI emergency mode aspect as well, which then allows DALI emergency lighting control of DT1 DALI drivers. So these are 2 new features that this firmware update has enabled us to then launch for the DALI gateway profiles. And finally, a few other small updates that are going to be in the September release. Previously, if you had a sensor and it also had a push button input, which can be done with certain ecosystem partner products. So if it had the 2 options of being a sensor with a push button input, in the sensor properties, you would first see a list of the push buttons, and then you would see the sensor options that you want to configure. So now the push button options are hidden in the sensor properties so that you only see the sensor options, because it was just a bit frustrating that you had to scroll through the push button options first of all to get to the sensor properties. In the control options, the fade time for switch dimming, which used to be limited to 3 seconds, has been reduced to 0 seconds. So this is basically the time it takes when you've got a Kasumbi enabled switch and you just push and hold it, for example, and so it dims up or dims down. It's the fade time when you're using a switch to dim the lighting. So you can now have that as a 0 second, so it's an immediate on or off. In the areas where you can log in or put a password into the network, you've also got a little eye where you can actually view the actual text of the password that you're putting in there. Previously it's just been dots there, so you couldn't be sure that you were necessarily putting in the exact password. You might have made a typing error, so you can actually then view or hide the password. Of course you can't view or hide somebody else's password, but the information you're entering can be seen. And one final update is that there's now a pop-up warning if you try and access a network that's created with Casambi Pro, if you try and access it from the original Casambi app. So there's a pop-up warning that says the network was created with Casambi Pro, and if you do any changes to the network, you can't do any more changes to the network or any other networks that are in the same project using Casambi Pro. So you have to be very you have to be very careful when you're accessing via the Casambi original app, because the Casambi original app is not designed as a tool for Casambi Pro editing. Casambi Pro and the original Casambi app are actually two totally separate types of software for two different applications, but you can get certain access from the original Casambi app to a Casambi Pro network. But if you then do go through various other steps to get in using the original app and make changes in the Pro network, you won't then be able to make any future changes offline using the Casambi Pro software. So that's good to know, and this is why there's a pop-up warning there. And that's the summary of all the September 2024 updates and releases. Of course, there are also, which aren't gone through here, there's some minor bug fixes also implemented in the same update.